In today's video, we're going to talk about boiled linseed oil and tung oil and how I use both of these, some of the pros and cons, and I'm going to show you the effects of each of them through 3 different coats. Most people, when they think of tung oil, think of this. This is not pure tung oil. In fact, I don't even know how much actual tung oil is in this, but when you go to the home center, this is generally what you get: a blend of tung oil, some other kind of general finish, and then a solvent base. Boiled linseed oil at least doesn't call itself linseed oil because it is linseed oil with a bunch of solvents, both of those so that they dry faster and they're more easily applied. I have some real tung oil. I'm not using it for this video because I don't have 3 months to wait for drying times of 3 different coats. So for now, we're going to set the real tung oil aside. Maybe we'll touch on that in the future. Let's start off with the single biggest difference in appearance. And that's going to be that you can build up more of a plasticky film kind of sheen with tung oil. And it's going to take you a long time and a lot of coats to get anything close to that with boiled linseed oil. So that is the biggest differentiator, in my opinion, of when I choose to use tung oil versus boiled linseed oil. If I want some kind of film-ish like finish, this is what I'm going for. If I want something that's more muted and doesn't have a natural sheen to it, I'm going with this guy. Let's start with the characteristics of the boiled linseed oil. Now, these are going to be pros and cons that may be pros for some people and cons for other people. It's very dependent on the user yourself, what you think of these characteristics. Boiled linseed oil provides a depth and a darkening kind of effect, but it also provides an amber look. If you are using a white maple and you want to keep it that white or like a whitish holly or something like that, this is a big no-no for you. This will turn it into kind of a yellowish, I don't want to say urine color, but amber. Let's go with amber if you put it on something extremely light. So just be aware of that. It will not keep a wood white. It will actually darken most woods. If you put it on some dark walnut, it's going to look much darker. It will bring out the colors, bring out the reds, and it's great for figure. It's going to provide a real stark contrast and help that chatoyance come through. I absolutely love it on figured woods. Boiled linseed oil, however, offers almost no protection. You can put a ton of coats on to build it up over time, but it's not a very protective finish. However, it's much easier to repair. Because it does not leave any kind of film, you can just go back and sand and apply another coat. And yes, you may have exposed some fresh wood. That's a little different in color, but that will darken with time. And with enough coats, you can build up I'll call it a film, a bit of a film, but it's never going to be like the tung oil or like any of the actual film finishes. It just doesn't offer that. It's not that type of finish. One of the upsides, in my opinions, is that this is really easy to paintbrush on or wipe on. It's liquidy enough to be able to kind of smear over a surface, and it's also got just enough kind of goopiness to it that it will also hold on to a paintbrush as you paint it on, and it's not like a water. So it's really flexible in terms of how you apply, whether you want to do it with kind of a rag or a brush, or I've seen people even just wipe it on with their hands to get really a good kind of dispersal. Doesn't matter, really easy to apply. One of the upsides of this is you get a bit more time to work with it, especially for that first coat, but even subsequent coats. You get a good 15-ish minutes before you need to start wiping it off. And even after you wipe it off, if a little seeps up, you've got another maybe 15, 20 minutes to wipe that off before it gets really tacky. I think it really gives a lot of kind of protection against forgetting that you put the boiled linseed oil on and now you got to run back and wipe it off. More so than the tung oil, this is forgiving and you get a little more time to apply. It's really good for larger projects in areas that aren't needing of protection. You can start at one end. By the time you get to the other, you can go back and it won't have started tacking yet. Some of that's going to depend on the temperature, humidity, but for the most part, you get at least 15, 20-ish minutes to wipe it on and wipe it off. Now, boiled linseed oil does not provide much of a sheen on its own. With enough coats, like I said, you can sort of get a bit of a film finish, but this is a matte finish. It's all going to come down to how you sand. If you go up to the quadruple at steel wool, if you go to burnishing, you can get a bit of a sheen from that, and then the depth of color with this. But if you're like most people and you only sand to 220, 320, there's not going to be any real sheen from this without a ton of coats. It's a very just kind of flat finish, which is totally fine, and a lot of people want that. But this is not going to provide you that kind of reflective look that other finishes will. One of the downsides to this, in my opinion, is that it's a bit slow to dry. You're looking at 24 hours to be dry to the touch, but even up to a week or more to cure. So it's not like a lacquer where every 5 to 10 minutes you can put on a new coat and in 24 hours you're just totally done. This is a bit slow. Now, because it's boiled linseed oil and the solvents are in there, it's much faster than actual linseed oil, but it's still relatively slow. Almost all oil-based finishes that aren't film finishes are. And one of the final upsides is that it's pretty cheap for the quantity and relatively easily available. Now, some states have laws regarding solvents, so depending upon your state or your country, you may not be able to get it, but most home stores are going to sell a boiled linseed oil of some type, and it's going to be relatively cheap and accessible. The tung oil pros and cons are in some ways similar, but in some ways different. The very first, the obvious here, is that this will create a sheen, kind of that plasticky look over time. If you want that, this is perfect for you. If you do not want that, don't use this finish. It's not going to get you the matte look. However, it will darken and kind of deepen the color in much the same way as boiled linseed oil. I like to think of it as the older brother in a way. It's got a little more polish, a little more shine onto it. But if you don't want that, this is not for you. One of the downsides in my experience is that you don't get as much time with this one. On the first coat, it's pretty good. You get about your 15-ish minutes. But for subsequent coats, you're looking at more like 5 to 10 before it starts to get tacky. And because it forms a film, that means you can trap dust on there. If you're using a rag to wipe it on or off that has fiber on it, that can get stuck in there and it can end up being trapped under the finish later on. You're definitely going to have to pay attention to that over the application and maybe even need to sand, whether with 400 grit or with a quadruple aught steel wool, to make sure there are no dust nibs stuck in there before you start applying coat after coat. Now, the upside of that is it does dry a little faster. You're still looking at 24 hours, but in general, this will kind of build up its total sheen to finish the plastic a little faster, well, a lot faster than boiled linseed oil. That takes so many coats to get there. So to get that kind of depth of color and the sheen, this is going to be a faster option. Just make sure that you wait the 24 hours between coats so that you don't trap any oil underneath that's still drying. It still takes a week or more to cure, but it's fine to use after that 24-hour period. One of the downsides that I found very specific to me is that with the boiled linseed oil, because it's a little slower to dry and it doesn't quickly build up any kind of film finish, if you miss a little spot, you can kind of come back, as long as it hasn't tacked too much yet, and remove it with a cloth and it will not have any problems. With this, if it kind of puddles-ish in any corner, it will be very noticeable. I make a lot of sliding lid boxes. They have a lip that the lid is glued into, so there's a little ridge right there. If any oil gets into that ridge and kind of seeps back out on the outside, it looks like there's a line of like plastic spread across there. It looks terrible. It can totally ruin a project and require fixing. So with this, be very careful with corners and any kind of 90-degree right angle areas. If it seeps into there and you can't get it out, it's going to be very noticeable. I end up with my lids drying them at an angle so that in case I missed any, I air compressor it out as well. It can't seep back out. It's just going to dry inside of there. It's very important to be careful with corners with this because it will look weird if you have any that kind of seeps out and then hardens in that area. For basic application, first coat, 15 minutes, keep it flooded on. If you've got something figured, you're going to have to keep watching it. It's going to sink more into the figure. Wipe it off. Very basic. Basically the same thing here as well. 15 minutes, keep it flooded, wipe it off, keep an eye on it. And then for both of them, especially if you're using something like oak or any kind of porous wood, come back 5, 6, 7, 10 minutes later, double check. If there's anything seeping out of the pores, wipe that off too. You don't want those spots hardening left over or getting tacky. For each subsequent application, boiled linseed oil, you're gonna give it about 10 minutes, wipe it off. You're gonna notice that if you flooded pretty well on the first coat, you're not gonna need anywhere as much on the second, third, et cetera, coats. It's not gonna sink in anywhere near as much. It's pretty simple. For this guy though, for the tung oil, on the second and third coats, we're talking more like 5 to 10 minutes max before it's going to start to get tacky. So be really quick and prepared to wipe it off if you've got a large project. I like to set timers no matter what I'm doing so that I can hear in my headphones, okay, time to come back and wipe it off. Be very careful. Wipe down your pieces ahead of time with something lint-free to make sure there's no dust, but especially with this guy, it will trap dust underneath. I considered not putting this in here, but I wanted to add it just to complete this. In terms of application, there's kind of a classical method that I don't know anybody that uses. I don't use it. However, it is kind of the wisdom that's been around for a long time with penetrating oils. 1 coat a day for a week, 1 coat a week for a month, 1 coat a month for a year, and then 1 coat every year after to kind of give that oomph back. It's a lot of coats. It's a lot of drying time. That's not for me. I'm a one flood coat and then a second coat a day or two later, and then sometimes a third, but not always a third. That's just me. If you want to follow the classical wisdom, go for it. It's just a lot of work. Any cleanup done with mineral spirits. But one thing I want to add, especially with the tung oil, but with the boiled linseed oil too, do not let it build up around this cap or on the inside of here, especially if you're the person that uses this over like 2 years. Down the road, you will be sitting there with like giant pliers trying to wrench this thing off of there. Just spray some mineral spirits on a little bit of towel, just wipe it down and wipe this down, because it does cure and harden. It will build up on there and it becomes very hard to open this thing up if you let it sit for a long time. As with any oil-based finish, when you're done cleaning it up, these have to be set out to dry. There have been people that prove that these can start fires if they're wadded up into a trash can. Lay these out, they will harden or kind of get stuck up, and you'll know that that's okay to then throw it away. This is an absolute must-do, whether you do it outside, preferably, or somewhere. I have a corner of my shop that I do it, especially in the winter. Just make sure you do that. Now, for the application, I've got a couple different species here, and I wanted you to get a look at them ahead of time, so we're going to come in closer. These are the bare pieces of wood. Everything has been sanded to 220, which is kind of the basic, most common sanding for most people before they apply a finish. I'm not going to go any higher, even though I personally normally do. We've got hard maple, and this was the lightest color I could find in my shop to hopefully show you the ambering. We've got walnut, oak, pine, or common board from the home center, cherry, and then some quilted maple. One will have boiled linseed oil, one will have tung oil, and then I will show quickly the first coat, then after the second and the third, we're going to go up to 3. This is after coat 1. Now the tung oil is on your right, and the boiled linseed oil is on your left. So all of these are tung, linseed oil. Now we can see some differences and some look very similar. We actually have more darkening, more ambering on the tung oil here, yet the walnut, which is from the same piece split open, is significantly darker with the linseed oil. One thing you can't have through the camera is the feel. The tung oil is much smoother as a light little film begins to build up than the linseed oil. With the linseed oil, we just purely feel the grain. And again, this is only one coat, so we're not getting as much sheen yet. I'm going to shine a much brighter light on these in a second, so you'll be able to see with even more light, because obviously the camera is going to depend on what you can see. Here is with more light. You may be able to see a little more differencing. On the BLO, we have a little more darkening over here. Again, for whatever reason, this maple, perhaps the figure in here, kind of, I don't want to say blotchy, but it's almost a little blotchy. The pine surprisingly stayed lighter with the linseed oil, which is not my general experience. Obviously, every piece of wood is different, although these are taken from identical pieces of wood. All right, we will move on to coat 2. We have the results after 2 coats, BLO, tung oil. Now I'm going to say right away that some of this is angle based. In person, I can see much more of a sheen forming on the tung oil than on the BLO than you can through the camera. As we can see though, we've got this odd difference in darkening. This walnut, again, these are from the same piece, just split open, much darker on the BLO. Whereas on the pine here, we've got more ambering on the tung oil, same with the maple. These, other than the sheen, are about the same. Cherry, slightly darker with the BLO, and then oak, definitely darker with the BLO, and no real sheen at all on any of the BLO versus the tung oil. So let's come in closer on a few of these. All right, we're going to start with the maple, and I want you to focus on this top area here. You can see the sheen as I turn them much more on this tung oil one than on the BLO one. Again, ignore this. This is mineral staining. On the walnut one here as well, we've got just an obvious kind of sheen building on the tung oil, but just a significantly deeper brown on the BLO. Outside of the walnut, I think the oak stands out the most. You can really see that sheen on the tung oil on this side versus the BLO, no matter which direction I change this in the light. Very noticeable on the oak there. And then on the quilted maple as well, you can see that sheen forming there versus the BLO, though this wood just has a natural chatoyance to it. So it's pretty good with either of them. But when I turn it in the light there, especially at the top here, you can see that sheen. This is after coat 3. And at least to my eyes, it's pretty abundantly clear now. The difference, these three are tung oil, these three are tung oil, boiled linseed oil, and boiled linseed oil. We can really see some differences here. If we look at as the light goes over here, especially look at the cherry, which is really close, we can see the reflectiveness difference on the tung oil and the linseed oil. We can see it definitely with this pine as well. We're getting much more reflection from the sheen on the right. Same with the oak. If we come over here to the walnut, again, you can see much more sheen on the tung oil than on the boiled linseed oil. And same with the maple. All right, we'll take a look quickly at them individually. Tung oil will always be on this side. You can see the sheen difference there. Tung oil on the right. This one's very noticeable, though I love the extra darkening on the boiled linseed oil there. Here's the quilted maple. You can see from the same angle there, there's definitely that amazing chatoyance, but you get that reflective sheen much more so in the tung oil. Here we have the hard maple. Again, this one really yellowed. I was a little surprised, but we definitely have the sheen. The oak, conversely, the tung oil stayed lighter, which is interesting. You can really see that sheen there. And then the pine, definitely a real noticeable difference there in the sheen. A little more yellow on this one and just a little more depth of color in the darker areas on the BLO. Well, that's going to do it for us today in our look at boiled linseed oil and the Tung Oil Blends. We've gone through 1 coat, 2 coats, and 3 coats, and the differences, you can see that more and more with each coat. The sheen gets progressively more noticeable. And at the end of the day, the Tung Oil Blend is going to offer a little more protection in that sheen, and the boiled linseed oil is, in my opinion, more idiot-proof, but you don't get that sheen unless you do something prior, such as burnishing or hand planing. If you hand plane and you don't care about the protection, you're going to get that natural sheen with the boiled linseed oil anyways. It's not going to take away. You'll notice on a hand planed finish, it's got that natural smoothness to it. And the boiled linseed oil will not change that much. So if you have any questions, let me know. For me, I generally go with boiled linseed oil because there's just very little room to make a mistake. With the tung oil, the corners, the lip of a lid, you can get some buildup and it can be bad. You can trap dust. But if you want any protection, the boiled linseed oil is just not ideal. You're going to have to apply many more than 3 coats to get anything out of it. So tung oil, boiled linseed oil, both great options. Hopefully you can choose now which one is right for your project. Thank you. Bye.